Episode 15 in 2nd Battalion the Essex Regiment and the Great War, a trying day, the 1st of July 1916. As is quite well known, the 1st of July 1916 was one of the worst days for the British Army, with 60,000 casualties, which is often conflated to be 60,000 dead, but in the military terms, casualties mean killed, wounded, missing, prisoners, just basically unavailable. Having said that though, the 1st of July 1916 was to be the worst day from a casualty point of view for the 2nd Battalion of the Essex Regiment. As looked at in previous episodes, the Somme offensive was part of an Allied offensive, French and British military working together to attack in the summer of 1916 using its new armies that had been developed. And previous episodes we've looked at what the plan was, but very, very briefly, the plan was to attack from west to east. On this map here, the British are marked in red, the German trenches are marked in green. And for the 4th Division, which the Essex Battalion was part of, they were going to be attacking around an area called the Heidenkopf in German, or the British called it the quadrilateral, due to its shape as marked on the maps. Now, the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment were part of the 12th Brigade of the 4th Division, and the 12th Brigade were attacking in the second line, the second wave of the attack. And so the plan was that they would be taking part in the attack, not the stereotypical type of advance or attack that we think of when we think of British soldiers kind of getting out of trenches and walking slowly towards the enemy. They had scouts that were under Lieutenant Allen. They had 2 companies that were going to be up the front to take on most of the fighting, with a further 2 companies, B and C, with supportive tasks. They'd also left some troops left out of battle under Captain Maitland, and that was to allow for casualties so that the battalion could kind of remake itself if it did have heavy casualties. And the 2nd Essex's role would be to advance from left to right on this map, from west to east, and get as far as Heidenkopf, which was marked on the map, and a little bit further to the east, to the right of the map, and to set up a number of strong points and occupy German trenches. So that was the plan, but as you probably already know or can work out from the beginning of this, it doesn't work out quite that way. And as the British troops advance in the morning of the 1st of July 1916, they find that the artillery barrage hasn't been as effective as they wished, and that the Germans are still there in some strength, though in the area of the quadrilateral they had actually pulled out some troops. The Germans had actually placed mines in front of the quadrilateral, and it's possible that some of those were blown as the British troops advanced. But the British find themselves coming under attack from the Germans that are still in the trenches, from in-depth positions, reserve positions, which are further east and can still fire onto that position. And as the day develops, they also find themselves being attacked from the flanks, the north and south, where unengaged other German soldiers are able to kind of come in and reinforce, very much as part of a German tactic of immediately counter-attack. Now, the way this affects the 2nd Essex is that as part of the second wave, their expectation is that they will move across no man's land, move across the first line of German trenches, which will by then hopefully be occupied, or it's expected they'll be occupied by their allies, and then continue the attack eastward. And that's not what they find when they do advance. Now, there's some accounts that perhaps there was messages sent to stop the Essex and that second wave advancing, but either way, they do go, and the 2 companies that are meant to attack first start to move across no man's land. And when they reach the German trenches, they find a situation of chaos. There are British troops there, there are British troops fighting, and so they kind of push through and try to continue the attack. And it is a matter of confusion, so for the purposes of this video, I'm going to try and keep things very basic. If you'd like to know much more, I recommend a book by Ralph Whitehead called The Other Side of the Wire, which, as the name kind of implies, is about the German experience, the German regiments that were defending this area at the time. And I'd also recommend Alan MacDonald's book, Z-Day, Z-Day, however you want to pronounce it, which is about the Corps and comes down right into lots of detail. 2 very good works to look at if you want more detail. But essentially, there's a series of confused reports that come back saying that the attacks have been quite successful, and that soldiers, potentially Essex Regiment soldiers, have been seen in Heidenkopf, which you might remember was that right at the far end of the objectives. Whereas in reality, some may have got quite away, but they're really bogged down in the area that we can see on this map here, the sort of first line of the German trenches, which are made up of more than one trench because they're supporting trenches. One of the issues that was facing all of the troops, the 2nd Essex particularly suffer with this, is that as they move over no man's land, they're coming under fire from the Germans from these in-depth positions and reserve positions. And many of the accounts say that once the British troops are in the German lines, that they start to run out of supplies, particularly hand grenades, which was deemed to be very essential for trench fighting. And the 2nd Essex had split itself down. You saw earlier the map of the different companies and responsibilities and so on. But one of the officers that was tasked to bring equipment across, like carriers, was Lieutenant Aubrey Holmes. And we see him here in the picture on the left. Now, Aubrey Holmes was born 36 years old. He was born in London and educated at Harrow School and Balliol College, Oxford. He joined the army in August 1914, perhaps in that wave of patriotism, as another ranker, a private in the Queen's Victoria Rifles, but ultimately was commissioned into the Essex Regiment. And he was killed on the 1st of July. So his job was as carrier's officer to make sure supplies were being brought across. And he's actually buried in Redan Ridge Cemetery No. 1, which is in amongst the area where the 2nd Essex were fighting on the day. I haven't been able to identify whether he was moved there as a later burial or that is literally where he was buried, the closest cemetery, etc. But that's something I will hope to look into a bit more in the future. So here we see a blue dot in the middle of the page, really, on Heidenkopf, which is where there are reports that Essex may have reached. It's possible, but it's more likely that they were still fighting in the area of Munich Trench, which is like the back edge of the first line of the German defensive positions. And one of the things that comes out in a lot of the reports afterwards is talk about the weapon you can see on screen here, the Lewis gun, which was a light machine gun. As the heavier machine guns, the Vickers machine guns, had been moved back into sort of brigade assets and ultimately were to end up as a part of the machine gun corps, a lighter, more mobile replacement was required, and the Lewis gun was seen as being that. And a number of reports in the after-action reports in the war diaries and accounts mention that the Lewis guns had a problem with jamming because they were getting dirty. A number of them were also damaged just in the rough and tumble of getting across no man's land and getting into the fight. And there's some elements here where the survivors with a number of Lewis guns get themselves into the German trench, following on from D Company. During that time crossing the no man's land and getting into the German trenches, though, of the party of men working the Lewis gun, 4 of them had become casualties. And these would have been carrying these extra drums that you can see on the top there, which are designed, or the magazines if you would call them that. Therefore, there's a bit of a shortage, and they have to start going rummage around, looking through casualties, looking through other equipment and trying to find them. And eventually they do manage to find a few more, but even after firing 20, 25 rounds and so on, they find that the guns jam and have to be sort of stripped apart and cleaned, and that some of them were actually damaged, as I think I've already said, as they came across. And one of the things they say about them is that if the man has to take cover, has to throw himself to the ground, is that the magazine is made of such a light tin that it can be dented, or light metal, that it can be dented and therefore it won't function any further. One of the other weapons that the British Army were using at the time, and I've already mentioned this once actually already, is hand grenades. And there's quite a few accounts from the fighting on the 1st of July about how the troops, once they were in the trenches, found themselves in hand grenade duels with the Germans, and they felt that the German hand grenades were actually much better. They had a longer handle, which allowed for a longer and perhaps more accurate throw, but also, a bit like the Lewis gun problem, that in crossing no man's land, many of the men that had been designated to carry hand grenades to bring them over had actually become casualties. Now, the accounts talk about a Lieutenant Ward, and we can talk about him a bit more in a moment, perhaps give you some background information. But at the moment, what we want to say about Lieutenant Ward is that he brought 40 men across no man's land with their task to be as bombers, as to be grenadiers, to throw these grenades. Now, one of the ways they did it is they had 2 sandbags hanging around their neck, each with 15 bombs in, And the idea was there was a slit down the side so they could sort of put their hand in and grab a grenade out. So you're talking sort of 30 grenades per man, 40 men coming forward, and other soldiers would have been carrying a couple of grenades as well. However, what Ward does is, as they go into the attack, he splits his party into two groups, one on each flank, which is quite sensible in many ways for their attack. But by the time Lieutenant Ward gets to the German trenches, by the time he gets his party of British soldiers into the German trenches and catches up with the soldiers that are fighting there, of the 10 men that were immediately with him, he only has one man left. So whether Ward was carrying grenades or not, we don't really know, but that puts obviously the number much less. Now, in my research, I found a photo of a Lieutenant Ward, and this is the man that is in the red square there. Whether it's the Lieutenant Ward on the day, or whether there was two Lieutenant Wards within the 2nd Essex, I've not been able to find out. Incidentally, in this picture here of 6 officers, the one down the bottom right is the Lieutenant Showers, and there was the Lieutenant Showers that also took part in the 1st of July attack. Again, though, I haven't been able to match up whether these are the same 2 people. So the attack is bogged down. They're not getting very far out of the German trenches towards their objectives. The casualties are becoming quite heavy, and in fact, ultimately, only Lieutenant Ward and Captain de la Mare are going to end up unwounded of the officers that go into the attack, and both of them are in the trenches fighting with their men and leading them. The commanding officer of the battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Sir George Stirling, seen here on the left, he's wounded during the attack. Now, he was an experienced officer. He'd served in many places before the First World War, as we've seen in previous episodes, and he had been in charge of the battalion for a number of months at this point. So he should have known his men well, should have known how to work his battalion and how to attack it. But unfortunately, he's wounded early into the attack, and some reports say he was actually wounded twice, so he stayed at duty for a while and then was so severely wounded that he had to retire. Now, that meant that the command of the battalion devolved to Captain Cadic, who was the adjutant, the commanding officer's assistant, if you like. And Captain Cadic is then left in charge of the battalion, but is himself wounded, though it would appear he did spend quite a bit of time fighting in the trenches during this attack before he has to kind of relinquish command of the battalion. Ultimately, Major Maitland, that you can see there on the right hand side, is going to end up in command of the battalion, moving forward for a short period of time. And you might remember he was one of the ones that was left out of battle at the beginning of the attack, perhaps for this very kind of reason. So the right hand dot is Pendant Wood, or Pendant Copse, where we were expecting to see the 2nd Essex men get to. The middle-ish dot is actually Munich Trench, where the 2nd Essex probably spent most of the day. But as they start to run out of their bombs, and as German pressure starts to build, it's highly likely that they were pushed further back into the very kind of back reaches of the quadrilateral, or the Heidenkopf as the Germans called it. And by now there's this sort of confused dogfight of a battle with very close combat, hand grenades being essential, as we've already discussed, people being shot down off the parapet as they stand to throw grenades and so on. And one of the officers that's still on his feet and still leading the battle is is temporary captain at the time, Andrew Guy de la Mare, who I've just mentioned already, who was commanding one of the companies in the attack. And he was actually awarded the Military Cross for his conduct on this day. The citation in the London Gazette, which was actually on the 22nd of September 1916, reads, "For conspicuous gallantry in action, at a critical moment in the attack, assisted by an officer and a company sergeant major, he organised a party of about 40 men of different units and manned and held a crater. They kept the enemy in check with some of the enemy's own bombs which they found. They were subjected throughout to heavy artillery and bombing attacks." And it's just about possible on the very left-hand side of the image there to see a couple of little red stars, and they are the actual map marking for craters. So it may be that his Military Cross was awarded for actions where they've been pushed that far back, but I've not been able to clarify that. As I think I've already mentioned, one of the other officers with him was Lieutenant Ward, and that's Leslie Jack Ward, who originally had joined up as a private in the Honourable Artillery Company and was commissioned into the 2nd Essex. and ultimately reached the rank was to reach the rank of captain. But yeah, more of him to come. One of the other company commanders that we have met before is Smith Masters that you see here. Now he was leading one of the companies into the attack. Bruce Swinton Smith Masters. He was aged 24. Is the son of the Reverend John Ernest and Eliza Margaret Smith Masters of Warren Lodge near Newbury. He was educated at Aylesbury School and Haileybury College, where he was captain of the cricket 7 seconds, second 11, and the rugby second 15. And he played cricket for Sandhurst, and he played it also for his regiment. He was commissioned into the Essex Regiment on the 14th of February 1912, promoted to temporary captain on the 2nd of June 1915. And if you've seen the previous episodes, you know that he was involved in the fighting at the Cato, on the Marne, on the Aisne, and at Maitland. He'd been wounded twice. He returned to the front and fought in the Second Battle of Ypres. He was awarded a military cross in the Birthday Honours of 1916, which I believe is the first sort of batch of military crosses. And he's actually buried in Sucre Military Cemetery. Now, Sucre Military, or the Sugar Factory, was part of the casualty evacuation chain of the 12th Division, of the 12th Brigade of the 4th Division on this day. So it's quite possible that Smith Masters was actually wounded, evacuated back down that chain of evacuation, but unfortunately succumbed to his wounds when he got to that aid post. It is possible that his men decided to evacuate him because he was liked, etc. But I think in the chaos of everything that was happening, it's much more likely he was wounded and was therefore evacuated but died of his wounds. Other casualties that we might mention here, and I'm very conscious that I often mention officer casualties, and it seems I mention them more than perhaps other rank casualties. It's just the way the records run and what is easier for me to kind of research. But on the left there is Albert Attridge, who is another rank. He had been a postman before he joined up after the beginning of the war, in that kind of, perhaps in that patriotic kind of thing that people did. And he was killed on the 1st of July 1916, and one of his comrades wrote to his family, and that letter was later published in a local newspaper, Attridge being from Leigh-on-Sea in near Southend-on-Sea in Essex. And in that letter from his comrade, it says that he fought very hard and he'd been fighting for 12 hours in the enemy trenches. So this would indicate that perhaps, if that is true at all, that he was part of the party that hung on in the trenches. And bearing in mind that they went into the attack probably somewhere about 9:30, 8:30 in the morning, the accounts differ. There's certainly reference to Essex men still being fighting in the German trenches at 5 p.m. And there are some accounts that say that they didn't get pulled out till after it was dark, which in a July summer is actually going to be very, very late. The other picture that we see on the side there is Lieutenant Leonard George Smith, and he was with B Company of the 2nd Essex and was aged 20. He was from Pitsea in Essex and had been educated at the Carlper Street School, the City of London School, and the Technical School Southend-on-Sea, which is now kind of been merged into Southend High School for boys. He also enlisted as a private into, in his case, the Middlesex Regiment, and was commissioned in February 1915. And unfortunately his body was not found, and he's commemorated on the Teepvale Memorial. You may recognise this picture from some of the ones that we've already shown you earlier today, or earlier in this little presentation. This is Geoffrey Allen. Now, Geoffrey Allen was in charge of the Scouts team, or the Scouts that took part in this attack. So Geoffrey Allen was born in Halstead, Essex, or North Essex, in 1887, and again had enlisted as a private, in his case in the Attridge Rifles, but had ultimately been commissioned into the 2nd Essex Regiment. And he graduated from St John's College in Cambridge in 1905, and his body was never found, and he is also inscribed on the Teepvale Memorial. What we have here is Lieutenant Middleditch. This is Lieutenant Archibald Milne Middleditch. Now, he's actually from the 12th Battalion Essex Regiment, but was attached to the 2nd Battalion and was aged 19 on the 1st of July 1916, which is the date of his death. He was from London and had been educated at Merchants, Tailors and St Paul's School, and he'd been working for export merchants before the war, and on the outbreak of the war, not sure of the exact date, He enlisted in Artist Rifles probably in August 1914. Again, commissioned then into the 12th Essex in December of 1914, and was actually attached to the 2nd Essex in October 1915. So he'd been with the battalion for about sort of 8-9 months. During that period, he had been wounded 3 times, and his body is not found on the 1st of July. And in fact, his and another one we will talk about shortly were not actually found until May 1917. Sorry, press the button too many times. On the left here we see 2nd Lieutenant Herbert Robert White. Now, on the day of the attack, he was one of those officers that had kind of been left out of battle, and he was originally, he'd been commissioned into the 3rd Battalion, which is like the sort of reserves, and been attached to the 2nd Essex. And you may see he's an older gentleman. On the 1st of July 1916, he was actually 37. One of the reasons for this is that he had actually served previously in the Essex Regiment as another rank, enlisting in 1895. He'd served in the South African War, transferred across to the 2nd Essex Regiment after that, and had served with them in Malta and at home, and had become the regimental quartermaster sergeant during that period, and that's the appointment that he held when the battalion went to France in August 1914. He was actually commissioned in May 1915, which you may remember as the time of the Second Battle of Ypres, and was well regarded. And in Alan MacDonald's book, Z Day, which we've already mentioned, there was actually some reference to him. And one of his men followed him out into no man's land. 3/4 of the way across, White turned as if to shout an order, but was shot and killed outright. He'd been a popular officer, a man from the ranks, but a gentleman right through. One of his men later wrote, "How I wish Mr. White had come through. He was well liked by his platoon, a gentleman and a soldier. Always had a kind word for the men, and one whom any soldier would follow." And what I think is interesting is that these officers that were in the left out of battle, the reserve, are finding themselves pushed into the attack. And that is true of the guy we see here on the left, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Norman Eade. Now, I've not managed to find out a lot of information about him, but what I have picked up is that he was from Wanstead in Essex. And one of the reasons that I've picked this up is that he's commemorated in the cricket club. They're part of their war memorial. And he's also commemorated on the Wanstead Rugby Club memorial as well. So maybe that gives us a bit of an idea of him as a man. And he's also on the Lloyds of London war memorial as well, which I imagine relates to his pre-war employment. Now, Eade again was one of the officers that was left out of battle as a reserve in that initial plan of attack, but it would appear that he had been pushed into the attack as well. But he is buried at Sucre Military Cemetery along with Smith Masters, and he doesn't die until the 2nd of July 1916. So that again suggests that he was wounded in action and was evacuated down that chain of evacuation, made it that far and died, or was expected to die, and therefore didn't make it any further down the chain of evacuation. And here we see images which I got from the Redbridge Museum website, so I've left their kind of logo in there to credit them, of Thomas Norman Eade on both the left hand, which is the cricket club, and the right hand, which is the rugby club. Now, another officer that his story continues after the 1st of July in one particular way is the guy we see on the screen now, the 2nd Lieutenant Gilbert Waterhouse. Now, he was with C Company, and we saw his picture earlier in our kind of plan of attack type diagram, and he's aged 33 on the day of the attack. He was born in Chatham and was educated at Bancroft School and the University of London, and was qualified as an architect. And as with many of the other young officers we see at this stage of the war, he'd enlisted as a private in the beginning of the war, and he'd served with the Royal Fusiliers and was ultimately commissioned into the Essex Regiment in May 1915, again around the time of that second Ypres attack. Now, Gilbert Waterhouse was actually a poet, and he had a volume of poetry published posthumously in 1916. Now, I'm not going to inflict that upon you. My attempts to read poetry, if you Google it, you'll see a number of poems that he had written. But as was often the case with officers, there was an attempt made to try and find out what had happened to them, who had seen them last, and so on. And a Private J. Atkins may have been one of the people that saw him last. And when he was interviewed in Attridge, which is a military hospital, about 10 days after the attack, he had the following to say: "I last saw Lieutenant Waterhouse on the 1st of July, about 9:30 a.m, 2 hours after the start. Now remember, just a quick pause on that, there's been some kind of, was it an 8:30 attack, was it 9:30 attack, what time system were they using and so on, so we'll have to let that slide a little bit, I'm afraid. So back to Atkins' account. He was a very brave man, and he stood out most conspicuously than anyone. He seemed so fearless. On the 1st of July, between Sayre Wood and Beaumont, about 9:30 in the morning, I had got over one German trench and was advancing to a second when I was hit in the back. I was carrying bombs and I was going on again when I caught sight of Lieutenant Waterhouse about 30 yards from me. He had a revolver in his hand and he stood out, a solitary figure. I saw him drop to his knees and begin to crawl, and I did the same, and so did his platoon. I thought at the time he had seen a machine gun and was avoiding the fire, but he may have been hit. And Gilbert Waterhouse is reported as missing on the 1st of July 1916, but his body was actually discovered in July 1917, and he was buried in the cemetery that occupies basically the area of the Heidenkopf, the quadrilateral, which is Sayre Road number 2 cemetery. And in this image here, which is a mixture of a trench map from February 1917 and the Google map kind of overlay of the area, I've just put it on to show you that ultimately the Somme attacks do continue, as we will find out, and a lot of the territory that the 2nd Essex were trying to capture on the 1st of July 1916 was then in the British hands by 1917. Now that's no kind of thing to celebrate or anything, but what it meant is a number of these bodies were then recovered and given the dignity of a kind of a known burial. So speaking of burials and death and so on, I've already said that it was the worst day for the battalion from a casualties point of view. In the regimental history by Burroughs, the chapter title is a trying day, which is what I've named this episode. And Burroughs lists that 24 officers and 606 other ranks went into the attack. But at the end of the day, there was only 2 officers left, and we believe that's Captain de la Mare and Lieutenant Ward, and there was 192 other ranks sort of still at duty. So obviously a large number of killed, wounded, missing, prisoners perhaps as well. Now, looking at the Commonwealth War Grave Commission data now, in sort of many years later, I can identify 9 officers and 137 other ranks that were killed in action on the 1st of July. Now, this doesn't account for people like Thomas Eade that dies the day after of his wounds, and obviously there'll be a number of other casualties like that. Also, the 2nd Essex had been pulled back eventually out of the German front lines back to the British front lines, but were to find themselves back in the British front line on the 2nd, 3rd of July 1916. So there wasn't much rest, and they were to continue to have further casualties throughout the month of July. But the 1st of July was one of the worst days for the battalion in its history in the First World War. And we see here on this little map thing a number of the cemeteries that we've just mentioned. So depending on how good your eyes are, depending on how good the screen is, you might be able to pick out some of them. Starting sort of top left, we have Sayre Road Cemetery number 2, and that is pretty much where the quadrilateral sat, and that is where the sort of attack starts to take place, and that is where Gilbert Waterhouse is buried amongst 18 of his comrades from the battalion. Coming down the screen a little bit, we can see Redan Ridge number 1 and number 3. And in Redan Ridge number 1, that is where Lieutenant Aubrey Holmes is buried, and there are 3 other members of the battalion buried with him. I've already mentioned that it's not on the picture here, it'll be off to the left, off to the west, Sucre Military Cemetery, and that's where Smith Martyrs and Eade are both buried, and there's a further 11 2nd Essex casualties from the 1st of July buried there. There's 3 other cemeteries which have 1 casualty in each, but the vast majority of the 2nd Essex casualties from the 1st of July have no known burial, and therefore they are commemorated on the Teepvale Memorial. And one of the ones that is mentioned on there is Sergeant Sharpley, who has come into our story many times already. Sergeant Sharpley, Distinguished Conduct Medal, several mentions in dispatches, and who had played football for Leicester. Now, I've still not been able to source a photo of him. That's an ongoing mission, so hopefully stick with me, and hopefully I'll find one for you at some point. On that note, if you are enjoying these videos, do let me know, and if there's anything you want to sort of know more of or less of, etc., again, do let me know. It's a bit strange when you don't get any feedback to sort of know which direction to take things in, and if you are enjoying them, I'd like you to like it, and if you can, subscribe, because then I know that there's kind of people coming on this journey with me, and it encourages me to make more videos. So hope to see you in the next one.